The dust of the palæstra hangs suspended in the golden afternoon light, a haze of crushed limestone and dry earth that coats the skin of every young man in Athens. In this place of sweat and struggle, the air is thick with the scent of olive oil and the rhythmic heavy breathing of athletes. Here, beneath the watchful gaze of the statues of Hermes and Apollo, the body is tempered like iron, forged in the heat of exertion to serve the state. Among the grappling youths, one figure commands attention, not merely for his strength, but for the sheer expanse of his presence. He moves with the heavy, deliberate grace of a predator, his chest rising and falling like the tide of the Aegean Sea. He is a young man of 20, wrestling in the sand, his muscles glistening under the relentless Mediterranean sun. His name, given to him by his father Ariston, is Aristocles. It is a noble name, a heavy name meaning best glory, chosen to honor a grandfather. But in the gymnasium, amidst the grunts of exertion and the thud of bodies hitting the earth, no one calls him Aristocles. Here, he is known simply by the shape of his being. The wrestling master, watching the boy pin an opponent with a force that seems to stem from the earth itself, calls out a nickname that will eclipse his birth name for all eternity. He calls him Platon. Broad. The word means broad. It is a descriptor that clings to him because it is undeniable. His shoulders are wide, a vast shelf of bone and muscle built for carrying burdens. Some whisper that the name refers to the breadth of his forehead, a wide plain of intellect behind which a storm is gathering, or perhaps the breadth of his eloquence, which flows like a wide river. But in these early years, before the beard of wisdom turns grey, it is the breadth of the wrestler that defines him. He is a champion in the making, a competitor at the Isthmian Games, second only to the Olympics in prestige. He knows the discipline of the body, the way pain can be mastered by the mind, and the way the spirit, or thymus, flares up in the heat of combat. Yet, as he wipes the sand from his brow and steps out of the wrestling pit, the broad-shouldered youth carries a weight far heavier than any opponent. In his veins flows the blood of history itself. To look at him is to look at the foundations of Athens. On his father's side, he traces his lineage back to Codrus, the last semi-mythical king of Athens who sacrificed his life to save the city. On his mother's side, he is descended from Solon, the legendary lawgiver who drafted the constitution of the city-state. He is a child of the highest aristocracy, born into a world of marble porticos and symposia, where the expectation of power is not a hope, but a destiny. He is bred to rule, to stand in the assembly, to lead armies, to steer the great ship of Athens through the treacherous waters of the Peloponnesian War that has ravaged his childhood. But there is a secret war waging within the broad chest of Aristocles, a conflict between the expectations of his lineage and the whispers of his own soul. When the sun sets and the wrestling oil is scraped away, the young athlete retreats into the quiet corners of his family's villa. There, by the flickering light of an oil lamp, the hands that grapple and strangle in the day pick up a delicate reed pen. The wrestler is, in the silence of the night, a poet. He is consumed by the rhythm of words, the metre of the dithyramb, the tragic arc of heroes who fall from grace. He writes tragedies, pouring his soul onto papyrus rolls, dreaming not of ruling the state, but of conquering the stage. He wishes to be the next Euripides, to move the hearts of the breathless crowds in the theatre of Dionysus. He crafts verses with the same meticulous intensity he applies to his physical training, seeking perfect form, perfect metre, perfect imitation of the gods. He believes, with the fervour of youth, that art is the highest calling, that through the beauty of language he can capture the truth of the world. He is on the precipice of his debut. A tragedy, polished and perfected, sits ready. He intends to submit it to the great competition, to claim the ivy crown of the poet. He walks through the streets of Athens, the scroll tucked under his arm, his heart beating with the anticipation of acclaim. The city is noisy, a cacophony of merchants, slaves, soldiers, and politicians, a vibrant, chaotic democracy that he views with the critical eye of his class. It is then on his way to the theatre that he takes a path through the marketplace, the agora. The dust here is different from the gymnasium. It is the dust of commerce and conversation. And there, amidst the stalls of fishmongers and money changers, he sees a crowd gathered. They are not watching a wrestler or a politician. They are circled around a man who looks nothing like the heroes of Plato's tragedies. The man is ugly by Athenian standards. He has a snub nose, bulging eyes, and a protruding belly. He walks barefoot, wearing a tattered cloak that has seen too many winters. He looks like a satyr, a creature of the woods, wild and unkempt. This is Socrates, and he is speaking. The young poet stops. He intends to listen for only a moment, perhaps to find a character study for his next play, a figure of mockery, but the voice that emerges from the satyr-like face is not what he expects. It is not the booming rhetoric of the politicians who shout in the assembly, nor is it the flowery, hypnotic verse of the poets. It is something sharper. It is a blade. Socrates is asking questions. He is dismantling the confidence of a wealthy general, stripping away the man's certainty about what courage truly means. He takes the concepts that the broad-shouldered youth has taken for granted, justice, piety, beauty, and reveals them to be hollow shadows, the dialectic spirals, weaving a net of logic that traps the mind and forces it to look inward. Aristotle stands frozen on the edge of the crowd. The scroll of poetry under his arm feels suddenly heavy, dead, and superficial. He listens as Socrates speaks of the soul, of the necessity of caring for the mind over the body, of the search for a truth that is not found in the imitation of life which is all poetry, is but in the examination of life itself. The words strike the young wrestler with a physical force. He feels a vertigo, a dizzying realization that the world he thought he understood was merely a painting of a world, a shadow on a wall. The mesmerizing power of the barefoot philosopher pulls at the threads of Plato's ambition. He realizes that his tragedies, for all their beauty, are lies. They play with emotions but do not heal the soul. They mimic reality but do not explain it. The sun begins to dip low, casting long shadows across the agora, turning the Parthenon into a silhouette against a violet sky. The crowd disperses, but the young man remains for a long time, staring at the place where the philosopher stood. A transformation has begun, the shifting of tectonic plates within his psyche. The thymus, the spirited part of his soul that sought glory and wrestling and applause in the theatre, is bowing its head to logos, the reason that now awakens with a ravenous hunger. He turns away from the theatre of Dionysus. He walks back to his home, his steps heavy with purpose. He enters the courtyard where a small fire burns in a brazier, warming the cool evening air. He looks at the scroll in his hand, the tragedy he laboured over, the verses he thought would bring him immortality. He sees now only a distraction, a beautiful veil hiding the face of truth. With a solemn, broad hand, he unrolls the papyrus. The firelight dances on the ink, illuminating the lines of dialogue one last time. He does not hesitate. He feeds the scroll into the flames. He watches as the edges curl and blacken, the words turning to ash, the smoke rising into the Athenian night. He burns them all, the tragedies, the dithyrambs, the lyrical verses he offers them as a sacrifice to a new god, the god of wisdom. The wrestler has left the ring. The poet has left the stage. From the ashes of Aristocrates, the philosopher Plato begins to rise, his eyes fixed on a reality far beyond the shadows of the physical world. The sparks ascended into the night, ephemeral stars born from the ink of tragedies that would never be performed. Aristotle stood by the brazier until the last ember died, watching the heat warp the air around his hands. Those hands, calloused from the wrestling pits of the isthmus and broad enough to pin a man to the dust, were now empty of scrolls, empty of the poet's lyre. Yet they felt heavier than before. He had burned the bridge to his past, incinerating the vanity of artistic applause to clear the ground for something harder, colder, and infinitely more durable. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of a new resolve. In the cooling ash, the young aristocrat vanished, and the man history would know as Plato the Broad One stood alone in the quiet courtyard. But the silence of his private garden was a deception. Beyond the high walls of his family's estate, Athens was screaming. The city of Athena, once the glittering eye of Greece, was blind and stumbling. The long war with Sparta had stripped the gold from the statues and the honor from the men. Plato had grown up in the shadow of this conflict. The clang of bronze and the rumors of defeat were the lullabies of his generation. He looked up at the Acropolis, silhouetted against the indifferent moon, and saw not a monument of glory, but a tomb of hubris. The golden age was bleeding out, and the young philosopher felt the wound as if it were his own. He was born to fix this. It was written in his lineage. His father's bloodline reached back to Codrus, the last king of Athens who had sacrificed his life for the people. His mother's kin were descendants of Solon, the lawgiver who had etched justice into stone. For a young man of his station, physically formidable and mentally sharp, the path was preordained. He would step into the assembly, he would speak with the thunder of his ancestors, and he would steer the ship of state away from the rocks. Fate, however, offered a cruel twist. The democracy fell, crushed under the weight of its own failures and the Spartan boot, and in its place rose the 30. They called it a restoration of order, a cleansing of the chaotic mob. Among the leaders of this new regime were faces Plato knew well: Critias and Charmides, his own flesh and blood. They invited him to the seat of power, beckoning him to join in the reconstruction of a virtuous society. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the young philosopher believed that wisdom might finally take the throne. He walked toward the center of power, with hope expanding in his chest. But as he drew closer, he saw that the throne was not built on wisdom, but on bones. The order they promised was the stillness of the grave. He watched in horror as the regime turned upon its own citizens, executing rivals to seize their wealth, silencing dissent with the blade rather than the argument. The cleansing was a butchery. The broad-shouldered wrestler, trained to fight with honor and within the rules of the ring, recoiled from this formless violence. He saw his uncles not as guardians, but as wolves. He withdrew, retreating into the shadows of his home, his first political dream shattered not by failure, but by a success that looked like a nightmare. He realized then that power without philosophy was a knife in the hands of a madman. When the 30 tyrants eventually fell and the democracy was restored, a tentative, dusty light broke over the city. Perhaps now, Plato thought, justice could breathe. But the city was wounded, paranoid, and looking for scapegoats to blame for the years of misery. It was in this fragile, fevered atmosphere that the unthinkable occurred. The gaze of the restored state turned toward an old man in a coarse cloak, a man who owned nothing but his questions. Socrates. Plato sat in the crowd during the trial, his heart beating a slow rhythm of dread. He watched the 500 jurors, men driven by fear and resentment, casting their judgment upon the only man in Athens who truly sought to heal her soul. Socrates stood before them, not as a beggar pleading for his life, but as a physician diagnosing a terminal illness. He did not weep. He did not bring his children out to carry sympathy. He stood firm in the truth, speaking with the calm irony that had once mesmerized a young poet in the marketplace. But the marketplace was no longer listening. The verdict was cast. The hemlock was prepared. The death of Socrates was the final severance. It was a trauma that would vibrate through the soul of the West for millennia, but for Plato it was a personal apocalypse. He was ill on the day the poison was drunk a fever of the body, perhaps mirroring the fever of his grief. But in his mind's eye he saw it with agonizing clarity. The sun setting over the western mountains, casting long shadows into the prison cell. The steady hand of his teacher taking the cup, treating death as casually as one might treat a walk to the Piraeus. The numbness rising from the feet to the legs, a cold tide extinguishing the warmth of the wisest heart in Greece. When Socrates died, Athens died with him in Plato's eyes. The physical city remained, the noisy streets, the fishmongers, the politicians shouting in the ping mix, but the spirit had fled. Plato walked the streets like a ghost. He realized then that no existing state, be it ruled by the many or the few, was fit for a just man. The world of politics was a cave where prisoners watched shadows dancing on a wall, mistaking silhouettes for reality. They killed Socrates because he tried to turn their heads toward the light. A profound shift occurred within the architecture of his mind. If justice could not be found in Athens, if it could not be found in the physical world where bodies rot and regimes crumble, then it must exist somewhere else. It must exist in a place untouched by time or tyrants. In the silence of his grief, the seeds of a new vision began to take root, a realm of perfect, unchanging truths. He began to conceive of a place where the circle is never broken, where beauty never fades, and where justice is not a matter of a jury's mood. The chaos of the Peloponnesian War and the murder of his teacher drove him to seek a fortress that could never be sacked, a reality that stood above the shifting sands of human opinion. He could stay no longer. The stones of the agora burned his feet, the air of the city tasted of ash and betrayal. To find the state he wished to build, he first had to leave the one that had failed him. He packed his few belongings, the tools of a scholar, replacing the armor of a soldier. He looked once more at the gymnasium where he had wrestled, at the theatre where he had dreamed of fame, and finally at the small house where Socrates had once walked. He turned his back on the Acropolis. The road lay open before him, toward Megara, toward the ancient sands of Egypt, toward the mysteries of the Pythagoreans in Italy. The traveller replaced the citizen. The search for the philosopher king had begun, not in the halls of power, but on the dusty road of exile, leading him away from the city that killed his master and toward the horizon of the unknown. The road from Athens was not merely a distance to be crossed, but a severing of the soul from its source. As the city walls faded into the haze behind him, the man who had been Aristocles felt the phantom weight of the armor he had once worn as a cavalryman, a heavy remembrance of duty to a state that had turned upon its own conscience. He walked now, not as a soldier of Athens, nor as the broad-shouldered wrestler who had thrown opponents to the dust in the Isthmian games, but as a fugitive of the spirit. The dust that coated his sandals was the same dust that had settled in the cup of hemlock, and with every step away from the shadow of the Acropolis, he sought to distance himself from the chaos of human appetites that had sanctioned the murder of the just. For 12 years the wide-browed traveller moved through the world, a ghost drifting through the libraries of the wise and the courts of the powerful. He carried with him the trauma of the 30 tyrants, his own blood kin who had drowned the city in terror, and the equally brutal mob that had silenced Socrates. In the silence of the open road, the young poet who had once burned his tragedies in a fire of devotion now sought a poetry of a different kind of harmony, not of words, but of truths that could not decay. He travelled first to Megara, seeking refuge with Euclid, where the logic of arguments became a balm for his grief. But the mind required more than refuge. It required a foundation that the shifting sands of politics could never erode. He crossed the great waters to Egypt, walking beneath the colossal stillness of the pyramids. Here, among the priests of Heliopolis, he saw a civilization that did not shift with the winds of popular opinion. The priests, with their shaven heads and eyes like dark pools, told him that the Greeks were mere children, devoid of ancient wisdom, forever bickering over the new while forgetting the eternal. In the geometry of the Egyptian temples, in the perfect silent alignment of stone against star, Plato began to perceive the outlines of his great fortress. He saw that the world of the senses, the world where men aged, where statues crumbled, where justice was a matter of a vote, was only a shadow. Somewhere, beyond the reach of corruption, there had to exist the perfect form of justice, the perfect form of beauty, unchangeable and radiant. His journey pulled him further, to the sun-drenched coasts of Italy, to the disciples of Pythagoras. Here, the physical world dissolved into numbers and harmonies. He learned that the soul was not a simple vapour, but a tripartite harmony of reason, spirit and appetite. He recognized the wrestler within himself, the spirited thumos that sought glory, and he recognized the desires that plagued all men. But he saw that reason must hold the reins, like a charioteer guiding wild horses. The structure of his philosophy was rising, stone by mental stone, built from the mathematics of the cosmos and the desperate need for order in a chaotic century. Yet, the temptation to heal the world remained. The dream of the philosopher king, the union of absolute power with absolute wisdom, drew him into the lion's den. He was summoned to Syracuse, the glittering decadent court of the tyrant Dionysius. Plato arrived not as a conqueror, but as a physician to a sick state, believing that if one man, one supreme ruler, could be turned toward the light of philosophy, the entire polis would be saved. But the cave of the tyrant was dark, and the shadows on the wall were thick. Dionysius did not want wisdom. He wanted validation. When Plato spoke of a virtue that required the king to be the servant of the law, when he argued that a tyrant was the most miserable of men because he was enslaved by his own fears and appetites, the royal welcome turned to icy rage. The broad-shouldered philosopher, who had once debated in the gentle shade of the agora, now stood alone against the capriciousness of absolute power. The arguments that had mesmerized the students of Socrates sounded like treason to the ears of a despot. The rupture was violent and absolute. The tyrant, stung by the mirror of truth Plato held before him, handed the philosopher over to a Spartan admiral. The unthinkable occurred. The aristocrat, the descendant of Solon and kings, the greatest mind of his generation, was dragged in chains to the slave market of Aegina. There, amidst the bleating of livestock and the haggling of merchants, Plato stood upon the auction block. It was the ultimate manifestation of the world's madness. The man who carried the blueprint of an eternal city in his mind was priced and sold like a beast of burden. He looked out at the jeering crowd, stripped of his citizenship, his lineage, and his dignity, possessing nothing but the sovereignty of his own reason. In that moment of supreme humiliation, the theory of forms was no longer an abstraction. It was a lifeline. They could sell his body, the vessel of clay, but the mind that contemplated the good was untouchable, residing in a realm where no chains could bind. Fate, however, had not finished with him. A friend, Anisarius the Cyrenaic, recognized the philosopher in the crowd. Shocked by the sight of the sage in fetters, he paid the ransom 20 minae, a small price for the intellect that would shape the Western world. When friends later tried to repay Anisarius, he refused, saying that Athens was not the only city capable of appreciating Plato. He returned to Athens not as the young wrestler seeking a fight, nor as the naive idealist hoping to convert tyrants, but as a master who understood that the only true revolution begins in the education of the soul. He was 40 years old. The hair round his broad temples was greying, and the fire of his youth had tempered into a steady, illuminating resolve. He had seen the world, and he had found it wanting. He would no longer chase the courts of kings. If the perfect state could not be found in the world, he would create a womb where it could be born. A mile outside the city walls, past the Dippelon Gate, lay a grove of olive trees and plane trees dedicated to the local hero, Echedemus. It was a quiet place, watered by the Cephissus River, far from the shouting of the assembly and the noise of the market. Here Plato purchased a small plot of land. He did not build a fortress of walls and towers, but a sanctuary of dialogue. He called it the Academy. It was to be a gymnasium of the mind. He planted the seeds, not of crops, but of guardians. Young men came from across the Greek world, drawn by the reputation of the man who had survived the tyrant's wrath. They walked with him beneath the leafy canopy, the sunlight dappling the ground in patterns that shifted with the wind, while he spoke of things that did not shift. He taught them that the eye of the soul is more precious than 10,000 bodily eyes, for by it alone is truth seen. He posted no guards at the gate, only an inscription that warned, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." It was a warning that emotion and rhetoric were not enough. One needed the discipline of the immutable to approach the divine. For 40 years, the Academy became his world. He walked among the olive trees, the broad one, now the elder statesman of wisdom, wrestling not with bodies, but with the stubbornness of ignorance. He poured his memories of Socrates into the written dialogues, preserving the voice of his master in amber, crafting the republic that had eluded him in Syracuse. The seasons turned, the leaves fell and grew again, and the wars of men continued to rage beyond the grove. But within the academy time seemed to slow, synchronizing with the eternal rhythm of the dialectic. He had finally built the city he had searched for, a city of words and reason, standing invisible and invincible amidst the decay of empires. As the years pressed upon him, the tripartite soul of the philosopher prepared for its final severance. He was 80 years old when he attended a wedding feast in Athens. The noise of the revelry grew distant to his ears. He withdrew to a quiet corner to rest, closing his eyes as a Thracian girl played the flute nearby. The melody was simple, drifting through the air, but his mind, honed by decades of seeking the perfect ratio, noticed the slight wavering of her rhythm. Even in his final moments, the instinct for harmony, for the precise alignment of the beautiful and the true, remained his guiding light. He lay his head down, the broad forehead smooth and cool. The music of the flute merged with the music of the spheres he had studied so long ago in Italy. The man who had been a wrestler, a soldier, a poet, and a slave, slipped quietly from the shadow of the cave and out into the blinding, perfect sun of the reality he had always known was waiting. The scroll of his life was rolled shut, but the ink was indelible. Upon his death, the citizens of Athens, the very people who had once scorned his teacher, carried him in a procession to the academy. They buried him there, amidst the roots of the trees he had planted. He left no physical children, but he left a lineage of minds that would stretch unbroken for 900 years. His will was simple, leaving his small estate to his family, for the academy belonged to no one man, it belonged to the truth. And though the body of Plato returned to the earth of Attica, the questions he asked remained suspended in the air, drifting like the seeds of the plane trees, waiting to take root in the minds of those who would come after, in a world that would forever be shaped by the shadow of his broad shoulders. From the north, a new wind was beginning to blow, carrying the name of a student who had walked those very paths, a student named Aristotle, who would take the mantle of the master and weave a new tapestry of thought. The sun set over the academy, casting long shadows that pointed toward a future where the mind would categorize the stars and the stones, building upon the foundation laid by the man who had dared to dream of the light. To understand the shade of the olive tree, one must first understand the scorching heat of the desert sun that drove the gardener to plant it. Before the academy could rise from the dust of Athens, its founder had to fall, stripped of his name, his nobility, and his illusions, casting off the identity of Aristocrates to become the man history would know only by the breadth of his shoulders and the vastness of his mind, Plato. The golden thread of wisdom that would one day lead to Aristotle did not begin in a lecture hall. It began in a moment of absolute silence. The silence that fell over a jail cell in 399 BCE when Socrates drank the hemlock. For Plato, a young man of 28, that cup did not merely kill a mentor, it poisoned his faith in the world of men. He had been born to the highest blood of Athens, a descendant of kings and lawgivers, destined for the podium and the assembly. He had possessed the soul of a poet, once ready to submit his tragedies to the Dionysia, until the day he heard the old stone-cutter speak in the marketplace and realized that poetry was a beautiful lie, while dialectic was a jagged truth. He had burned his poems in a fire that consumed his past, but the execution of Socrates consumed his future. If the most just man in Athens could be legally murdered by a democracy, then democracy was a mob. If his own relatives, the 30 tyrants, could drown the city in blood during their oligarchic rule, then aristocracy was a monster. There was no safety in the state, no justice in the courts, and no order in the hearts of men. Plato turned his back on the Acropolis, the Parthenon, and the noisy, chaotic assembly. He did not just leave a city, he went into exile from the very idea of politics, seeking a geography of truth that could not be voted away by an angry crowd. His wanderings took him first to Megara, gathering with other frightened disciples of Socrates, huddled like sparks trying to keep a fire alive in the wind. But the grief was too near, and the answers too far. He pushed further, crossing the wine-dark sea, to lands where the history of Greece was but a frantic infant compared to the ancient silence of the sands. He warped the banks of the Nile, standing in the shadow of the great pyramids of Egypt. Here, under the gaze of the Sphinx, Plato found something that soothed the turbulence of his grieving soul: geometry. The Egyptian priests showed him a world governed not by the whim of fickle gods or the shouting of demagogues, but by eternal, unchanging ratios. A triangle drawn in the sand might be washed away by the river, but the idea of the triangle, the perfect form, the mathematical truth of it, remained untouched, immortal, and pure. Here was the antidote to the chaos of Athens. Here was a realm where a thing was true forever, regardless of who held power. The seed of the theory of forms was planted not in a garden, but in the geometric precision of Egyptian architecture, where stone mirrored the stars. Yet the mind needs more than static stone. It needs the music of the spheres. Plato travelled west to the Greek colonies of southern Italy to sit at the feet of the Pythagoreans. In Tarentum, he met Archytas, a statesman who was also a mathematician, a rare glimpse of the unity he craved. The Pythagoreans taught him that the universe hummed with a hidden harmony, a mathematical structure that underpinned reality. They believed the soul was a thing of divine origin, trapped in the debris of the body, longing to return to the stars. Plato listened, and the poet inside him awoke again, not to write tragedies of weeping kings, but to draft the architecture of a perfect soul. He began to see that the disorder of Athens was merely a reflection of the disorder within the human heart, that reason, spirit, and appetite were at war, and until they were balanced like the strings of a lyre, there could be no justice. But the temptation to test these theories in the clay of the real world remained a siren song. It drew him to Syracuse, the most powerful city in Sicily, ruled by the tyrant Dionysius I. Plato, now 40 years old, believed he could mold the tyrant's mind, turning a despot into a philosopher king. He believed that if power could be married to wisdom, the bleeding of the world would stop. It was a noble, desperate gamble, and it failed catastrophically. Dionysius was a man of appetites, not algorithms. He listened to Plato's talk of virtue with the amusement of a wolf, listening to a lecture on vegetarianism. The tyrant grew weary of the philosopher's moralizing, his insistence that a ruler must be the servant of the good. The tension snapped. Whether by a direct order or a convenient betrayal, the philosopher who sought to rule with wisdom was seized, bound, and thrown onto a Spartan ship. The broad-shouldered aristocrat, the descendant of Solon, the student of Socrates, was dragged to the slave market of Aegina. He stood on the auction block, displayed like livestock, the dust of the road on his tunic, and the chains of a prisoner on his wrists. It was the geometry of exile, in its most brutal axiom. In a world without wisdom, the just man is worth only his weight in labour. He watched the faces of the bidders, seeing the very appetites he had tried to tame. He was nearly lost to history, nearly swallowed by the anonymity of servitude, had it not been for the chaotic chance of a friend, Aniceris, recognizing him in the crowd and paying the ransom of 20 minae. Broken, humiliated, yet strangely purified by the fire of his failure, Plato returned to Athens. He had seen the world, and he had found it wanting. He had looked for justice in the courts of democrats and the palaces of tyrants, and found only shadows on the wall. He realized now that the ideal city, the Callipolis, could not be built with stone and timber, nor could it be forged by whispering in the ears of kings. It had to be built in the mind, cultivated like a slow-growing tree. He took the ransom money, which his friends refused to accept, back, and walked to a quiet grove outside the city walls, a place sacred to the hero Hecademus. It was a green sanctuary, far from the shouting of the assembly. There, amidst the olive trees and the statuary, he did not build a fortress or a temple. He built a school. He placed an inscription over the lintel, a warning and a welcome born of his travels in Egypt and Italy. a testament to the order he had found in the chaos. Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. The exile was over. The journey inward had begun. Plato sat upon a stone bench, the leaves of the plane tree whispering above him, and began to speak not of what the world was, but of what it ought to be. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the wrestling grounds where he had once competed, and as the first students gathered, young men hungry for a truth that did not bleed the philosopher closed his eyes and began to weave the first threads of a conversation that would never end. That conversation began in the quietude of the olive shade, but its roots were tangled deep in the soil of a violent past, a history that Aristocrates, now known to the world only as Plato, carried within him like a concealed weapon. The academy was not merely a school. It was a sanctuary constructed from the wreckage of a shattered idealism. To understand the serenity of the grove, one had to understand the storm that had necessitated its creation. For the man sitting upon the stone bench was not born a sage. He had been forged in the fires of a city that had lost its mind. He remembered the days before the beard of the philosopher covered his face, when his shoulders were broad from the wrestling pits of the Isthmian games, and his heart was set not on the eternal forms, but on the applause of the theatre and the power of the rostrum. He had been a creature of high blood, a descendant of the last kings of Athens and the great lawgiver Solon. The world was supposed to be his inheritance, but the Athens of his youth was a dying beast, tearing itself apart in the long grinding misery of the Peloponnesian War. He had watched the golden age turn to rust. The trauma that defined his soul was not merely the loss of the war, but the betrayal of his own blood. He closed his eyes against the dappled sunlight and saw the faces of his uncles Critias and Charmides. There had been men of culture, aristocrats who spoke of virtue, yet when they seized power as leaders of the 30 tyrants, they had unleashed a reign of terror that turned the gutters of Athens red. Plato, young and impressionable, had looked to them for salvation, hoping they would purge the city of corruption. Instead, he saw them turn upon the innocent, executing citizens for their wealth, silencing dissent with the cold edge of a blade. He realized then that noble birth did not guarantee a noble soul. This disillusioned aristocrat had turned to the democracy for hope, only to watch that very democracy condemn the one man who practiced true virtue. The memory of Socrates drinking the hemlock was the fulcrum upon which Plato's life had pivoted. It was the moment the poet died and the philosopher was born. He realized that neither the rule of the few nor the rule of the many could save humanity. The sickness lay deeper. It lay in the disorderly soul of man himself. In the quiet of the academy, Plato taught that the soul was not a single unified thing, but a chariot pulled by two wildly different horses. One horse was white and noble, representing spirit, the courage of the soldier, the drive for honor, the heat of the heart. The other horse was dark and unruly, representing appetite, the hunger for food, for drink, for flesh, for gold. And holding the reins was the charioteer, reason. It was a reflection of his own internal struggle. He felt the pull of the dark horse, the aristocratic desire for luxury and power. He felt the surge of the white horse, the burning anger at injustice. But he knew that unless reason held the reins with an iron grip, the chariot would crash. This belief was not a dry academic theory. It was a desperate prescription for a world gone mad. It was this conviction that drove him to make the most dangerous gamble of his life, a gamble that would exact a heavy price. Years before the peace of the olive grove, when the hair at his temples had just begun to grey, Plato had received a summons that stirred the dormant ambition in his chest. It came from the west, from the glittering, dangerous city of Syracuse in Sicily. The ruler there was Dionysius, a tyrant of immense power and unpredictable temper. The invitation was a siren song, come and teach, come and mould a king. Plato had written that the world would know no peace until philosophers became kings, or kings became philosophers. Now, fate called his bluff. He left the safety of Athens, boarding a ship bound for the Italian coast, driven by the hope that he could use the fire of his intellect to temper the steel of a tyrant's soul. He believed that if he could just show Dionysius the beauty of justice, the geometry of the good, the tyrant would lay down his sword and rule with wisdom. It was a naive dream, shattered by the hard stone of reality. Syracuse was a place of decadence, a city of feasts that lasted until dawn, of spies whispering in the corridors, of fear masked by opulence. Dionysius did not want a teacher. He wanted a flatterer. He wanted the prestige of the famous Athenian philosopher without the burden of his morality. The friction was immediate. Plato, incapable of falsehood, spoke of the virtues of a just life, of the misery of the unjust man who is a slave to his own desires. He spoke too clearly. He held a mirror up to the tyrant, and Dionysius, seeing a monster in the reflection, flew into a rage. The lessons ended not with enlightenment, but with a death warrant. The events that followed remained a dark scar in Plato's memory, a reminder of the fragility of human dignity. He was placed on a Spartan ship, believing he was being sent home, but the captain had other orders. The vessel did not turn east toward the Piraeus. It docked at the island of Aegina. At that time, Aegina was at war with Athens, and any Athenian found on its soil was subject to immediate execution or enslavement. There, in the dusty, sun-baked market of Aegina, the broad-shouldered aristocrat, the man who had wrestled in the games and debated the nature of the divine, was dragged onto the auction block. The irony was a physical blow. He who had written that the body was merely a prison for the soul, now found his body owned by another man. He was stripped of his name, his lineage, and his philosophy. To the merchant with the gavel, he was not Plato. He was merely a strong back and a set of eyes, a unit of labour to be sold to the highest bidder. The noise of the market was deafening the shouting of hagglers, the bleating of goats, the weeping of captives. Plato stood silent, his face a mask of stone. He retreated inward into the citadel of his own mind. He practiced what he had preached, that a good man cannot be harmed by the bad, for his true self, his virtue, remains untouched. They could sell his hands, but they could not buy his reason. He watched the spectacle of his own enslavement as if he were a spectator in the theatre, observing the absurdity of fortune. It was the intervention of chance, or perhaps the design of the gods, that saved him. A man named Anaceris, a Cyrenaic philosopher and an admirer of Plato's intellect, happened to be in the market. He recognized the noble bearing of the slave on the block. Shocked and horrified, Anaceris paid the ransom 20 minae, a sum that was both a fortune and a pittance for the mind it purchased. The chains were struck off. The transaction was recorded in the dust. Plato was free, but he was changed. He returned to Athens not as the ambitious politician, nor merely as the grieving student of Socrates, but as a man who had stared into the abyss of absolute powerlessness and survived. He walked back into the city of Athena. The dust of servitude washed from his skin, but the memory of the chains burned into his psyche. He gathered his friends, who offered to repay Anaceris the ransom money. But the Cyrenaic refused, saying that they were not the only ones who had the right to admire Plato. The money, rejected, was instead used to purchase the land for the school, the very grove of Hecademus, where he now sat. Thus, the academy was bought with the price of his own body. It was founded on the realization that the world of politics was a cave of shadows where men killed for illusions. The only escape was to ascend, to turn the soul away from the shifting darkness of the senses toward the unchangeable light of truth. The sun had now set completely over the olive trees. The first stars began to prick the violet canopy of the sky, perfect points of light that obeyed the eternal laws of geometry, untouched by the chaos of human affairs. Plato looks at the young men gathered around him. They were the future guardians. He would teach them not how to seize power, but how to despise it. He would teach them that the soul is a divine spark, trapped in clay, and that the only freedom worth having is the freedom of the mind. He picked up a stick and drew a circle in the dirt at his feet, a perfect form in an imperfect world. The wind rustled the leaves, sounding like the whispers of the dead, but his voice was steady, anchoring the night. He began to speak of a cave, and of prisoners bound not by iron chains, but by their own ignorance, staring at shadows on a wall and calling them reality. The imagery of the cave lingered in the cool night air, hanging between the teacher and his students like a veil being slowly lifted. The fire he had described was merely a metaphor, yet in the quiet darkness of the grove, the orange glow of a nearby torch seemed to embody that very illusion, casting flickering, uncertain shapes against the gnarled trunks of the olive trees. These were not just any trees, they were the sacred olives of the academy, rooted deep in the soil of a park, dedicated to the ancient hero, Hecademus. They stood as silent sentinels, their leaves shimmering with a dusty silver hue under the starlight, witnessing the birth of a new kind of sanctuary. Here, 6 stades from the Dipylon gate, the noise of Athens faded into a distant, rhythmic hum, irrelevant and small. The shouting of the assembly, the clatter of chariot wheels on stone, and the aggressive bargaining of the marketplace did not penetrate this refuge. In the grove of the academy, the only currency was thought, and the only conquest was the mastery of one's own soul. Plato stood tall among the seated youths, his silhouette robust and imposing against the backdrop of the night sky. The nickname given to him in his youth, Plato, the broad one, still suited him. His shoulders, once conditioned for the brutal grappling of the wrestling ring, now bore the invisible weight of a philosophy that sought to redeem the world. He paused in his lecture, allowing the silence to do the work of instruction. The wind shifted, carrying the damp earthen scent of the river Cephissus, a smell that spoke of life and continuity. As he looked at the faces of the young men, some the sons of aristocrats, others travellers from distant lands, his mind drifted briefly from the abstract to the personal, traversing the jagged path that had led him to this grove of peace. He remembered the flames of his youth, not the metaphorical fire of the cave, but the literal fire in which he had burned his tragedies and dithyrambs after hearing the voice of Socrates. He had once desired the applause of the theatre, to weave emotions into verse, but he had learned that poetry often mimicked the shadows, stirring the passions without enlightening the reason. He had traded the laurel wreath of the poet for the rugged uphill path of the dialectic. A darker memory surfaced then, a shadow passing over his internal vision. He remembered the blinding sun of Sicily and the opulent, suffocating court of Syracuse. He had travelled there with the highest of hopes, believing that if a ruler could be taught to love wisdom, the suffering of the state would cease. He had tried to mould the tyrant Dionysius into a philosopher king, to temper absolute power with absolute reason. But the human appetite for dominion is a beast not easily tamed. He recalled the flash of anger in the tyrant's eyes, the sudden dismissal, and the harrowing journey that followed. The great philosopher, the descendant of Solon and kings, had been seized, stripped of his rights, and placed upon an auction block in the slave market of Aegina. He could still feel the phantom sensation of iron on his wrists, the crushing realization that in a corrupt world, wisdom offers no immunity against brutality. He had been sold for 20 minae, a price put on a mine that contained the cosmos. It was only by the grace of his friend Aniceris, who ransomed him and refused to be repaid, that he stood here tonight, a free man, in a free garden. That money, returned and refused, had purchased this land. The ransom of his body had become the foundation of this academy. It was a poetic justice that the gods might appreciate. The price of his slavery had built the fortress of his freedom. Plato turned his gaze back to the ground, where the circle he had drawn remained perfect and undisturbed. He tapped the center of it with his staff. This was why he had inscribed the warning above the entrance to the grounds. Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. It was not a demand for mathematical cleverness, but a requirement for a soul prepared to see the unseen. In the chaotic world of the senses, there is no such thing as a perfect circle. Every wheel is slightly warped, every drawn line has thickness and flaw. But here, in the mind, the circle exists, eternal, unchanging, divine. He needed his students to look past the imperfect shadows of the physical world, to see the luminous forms that lay behind them. The soul, he said softly, his voice resonating with a hypnotic, melodic timbre that betrayed his past as a poet, is like a chariot. He began to weave the image for them, his hands moving gracefully in the dim light. He spoke of the charioteer, Reason, struggling to control two winged horses. One horse was white, upright, and keen of limb the spirit, a lover of honour and modesty and temperance, needing no whip, guided only by the command of the voice. The other was black, crooked, lumbering, and ill-made the appetite, companion to excess and boastfulness, death and shaggy-eared, hardly yielding to whip and spur. The students leaned in, captivated by the struggle he described, for they recognized it within themselves. It was the universal war fought in the chest of every human being. Plato watched them, seeing the potential for order in their chaos. He was teaching them to be the charioteers of their own lives, to pull back on the reins of the dark horse and allow the white horse to soar toward the rim of heaven, where true reality resides. The night deepened and the constellations wheeled slowly overhead, a grand, silent clockwork governed by the same laws he taught in the garden. The great bear dipped lower, and the owl of Athena hooted softly from the high branches, a solitary note in the symphony of the dark. The tension of the lecture began to dissolve into a contemplative peace. The intense intellectual fire was banking down into glowing embers of reflection. Plato let the stick fall from his hand. The lesson was not finished, for philosophy is a journey that never truly ends. But the mind, like the body, requires rest to assimilate the light. He looked around the sanctuary of olive trees one last time, feeling the protective embrace of the grove. The chaotic world of tyrants and mobs was far away, held at bay by the invisible walls of wisdom they were building here, stone by stone, thought by thought. He motioned for the students to rise. There was no need for dismissal. The rhythm of the academy was fluid, moving from discourse to silence, from activity to rest. As the group began to disperse toward their humble sleeping quarters, the sound of sandals scuffing softly against the dry earth mingled with the whispering leaves. Plato remained for a moment longer, alone in the center of the grove. He looked up at the stars, those perfect, fiery geometries, and breathed in the cool night air, preparing his spirit for the final movements of a life dedicated to the ascent. The noise of the world had faded completely, leaving only the profound, expectant silence that precedes a long journey home. The stillness of the grove was not merely an absence of noise, but a presence of peace, a tangible weight that settled over the shoulders like a warm cloak. Standing there, bathed in the silver luminescence of the night sky, the old philosopher felt the years fold over one another, the distant past becoming as vivid as the olive bark beneath his fingertips. He was an old man now, 80 years of life etched into the lines of his face, a face that had seen the rise and fall of tyrants, the death of the just, and the birth of a new way of seeing the world. But in the quietude of this sanctuary, under the gaze of the eternal constellations, he was also the young boy named Aristocrates, a name that carried the heavy expectations of a lineage tracing back to the godlike kings of Athens and the lawgiver Solon. He looked down at his own hands, now weathered and veined, and remembered when they were the broad, powerful hands of a wrestler. The memory washed over him with the scent of oil and the grit of the gymnasium floor. He could almost feel the phantom ache in his muscles, the strain of the grapple, the roar of the crowd at the Isthmian Games. They had called him Plato then, a nickname born from the breadth of his chest and shoulders, a testament to the physical, formidable nature he had cultivated. He had believed then, with the fervour of youth, that perfection was found in the balance of the body, in the victory of the arena. He had been a creature of the earth, grounded, strong and proud, ready to take his place among the elite cavalry, ready to fight for a city that glittered with the promise of empire. But there was another fire burning in the young Aristocrates, a flame different from the competitive heat of the wrestling pit. It was the fire of the poet. How many nights had he spent hunched over parchment, his broad shoulders curved in concentration, crafting tragedies that he hoped would rival Euripides. He had woven words into intricate tapestries of emotion, seeking to capture the human condition in rhythm and meter. He remembered the stack of scrolls, the weight of his artistic ambition, the certainty that his voice would ring out in the great amphitheatres of Athens. Then came the voice that shattered the silence of his certainty. The memory drifted through the olive trees like a ghost, the image of a man who looked nothing like a hero. Socrates. He was short, snub-nosed, with bulging eyes, wandering the marketplace like a stinging ray, paralyzing men with questions they could not answer. Plato remembered the first time he stopped to listen. The dialogue was not a performance, it was a dissection. Socrates stripped away the painted layers of society, of custom, of assumed knowledge, until only the raw, often uncomfortable truth remained. In the presence of that strange hypnotic dialectic, Plato's tragedies turned to ash in his mind before they ever touched a flame. He recalled the specific, visceral moment of decision. It was a surrender, a sacrifice. He had gathered his poems, the dithyrambics, the meticulously crafted verses, and fed them to the fire. He watched the ink curl and blacken, the words vanishing into smoke. It was a violent act of purification. The poet died, so the philosopher could breathe. He realized then that art was merely an imitation of the world, and the world itself was but a shadow of the truth. Why spend a life painting reflections when one could hunt for the source of the light? The wind shifted in the grove, rustling the leaves with a mournful sigh, mirroring the darkening of his memories. The golden haze of youth gave way to the iron grey of war and betrayal. The Peloponnesian War had raged for decades, a slow-moving storm that eroded the soul of Athens. Plato closed his eyes and saw the faces of his own kin, his uncles Critias and Charmides. They had been men of high birth, men of his own blood, yet when the democracy fell, they became the leaders of the 30 tyrants. He remembered the horror that sat cold in his stomach as he watched them turn the city into a slaughterhouse, purging enemies to steal their wealth, ruling through terror. He had once dreamed of standing on the mix, of guiding the state with rhetoric and law. But seeing his own family drowning in blood and hubris taught him the first bitter lesson of the cave. Power without wisdom is madness. He retreated, sickened, waiting for the light of democracy to return. But the return of the people brought the ultimate tragedy, the trial of Socrates. Even now, 40 years later, the grief was a sharp stone in his chest. The city he loved, the democracy that prided itself on freedom, had condemned the most righteous man in Athens to death. He remembered the cell, the weeping of friends, and the calm, terrifying serenity of Socrates as he reached for the hemlock. In that cup of poison, Plato saw the death of hope for any earthly state. If the best of men could be killed by the ignorance of the mob, then the world as it appeared was a lie. It was a realm of flux, of opinion, of shadows dancing on a wall, where men mistook the silhouette of justice for justice itself. That trauma had fractured his reality, but through the cracks the light of the forms had poured in. He began to understand that if the world was chaotic, if good men could die and tyrants could rule, there must be a higher realm, a place of immutable perfection. He sought a reality that could not be voted away by an angry assembly or destroyed by a Spartan spear. He built a fortress in his mind, a realm where the circle was perfect, where justice was absolute, where the good shone like an unsetting sun. This was not a retreat from reality, but a desperate, courageous voyage toward it. His journey had taken him far from Athens, seeking the wisdom of Egyptian priests and Italian mathematicians. He travelled to the court of Syracuse, to the tyrant Dionysius, driven by the naive burning hope that a ruler could be turned into a philosopher. He remembered the opulent halls of Sicily, the heavy scent of wine and danger. He had spoken of virtue to a man who only understood force. The clash was inevitable. The philosopher's words were sharper than the tyrant's sword, and for his insolence, the aristocrat, the descendant of kings, was sold like cattle. The memory of the slave market in Aegina rose up, the humiliation, the chains, the jarring noise of haggling voices. It was the ultimate descent. The man who contemplated the eternal forms was reduced to a commodity priced at 20 minae. Yet, even in chains, his mind remained free. The body could be enslaved, but the rational soul, the charioteer of reason, could never be shackled. When his friend Anaxagoras recognized him and paid the ransom, freeing him to return to Athens, Plato returned not with vengeance, but with a crystallized purpose. He walked back to the grove of Hecademus, this very ground beneath his feet, and planted the seeds of the academy. It was to be a sanctuary for the soul, a place to train the guardians who might one day descend into the cave and break the chains of others. He looked up again at the stars, the great geometric dance of the cosmos. The world called him a dreamer, an idealist lost in the clouds. They did not understand that he was the only one awake. He had spent his life trying to drag humanity out of the subterranean cavern of ignorance. He had penned the allegory of the cave, not as a story, but as a map of his own life. He knew the pain of the light. He knew how the eyes burned when they were first forced to look at the sun. He knew the ridicule of the prisoners who loved their chains and the shadows they cast. The academy was his attempt to create a space where the eyes could adjust, where the soul could remember what it knew before birth. He thought of his students sleeping nearby Aristotle, with his sharp, devouring intellect and the others. They were the future. They were the sparks he had struck from the flint of his own suffering. The night air grew cooler, signaling the deep hour before dawn. Plato wrapped his himation tighter around his shoulders. The wrestling matches of his youth, the political battles of his manhood, the terrifying voyages across the sea, they all seemed to drift away, leaving only the pure distilled essence of thought. He was tired, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that felt like the tide receding from the shore. The music of the spheres seemed to hum in the silence, a rhythmic vibration that resonated with the beating of his own heart. He turned slowly, his sandals making no sound on the soft earth, and began to walk toward his small dwelling at the edge of the grove. The olive trees stood like silent sentinels, witnessing the passage of the man who had tried to build a city of words in the soul of humanity. He was ready to rest, to let the tripartite soul find its equilibrium in sleep. But as he reached the threshold of his room, a faint melody drifted on the wind, the sound of a flute, simple and clear, played by a Thracian girl in a nearby house. The notes hung in the air, imperfect yet striving for harmony, a human attempt to capture the divine order. He paused, listening to the rhythm, his mind automatically correcting the tempo, seeking the perfect measure even in the final moments of the night. That faltering note, suspended in the cool night air of the olive grove, did not merely dissolve into the silence. It travelled backward through the corridors of his memory, vibrating against the iron doors of the past. The old man, standing at the threshold of his final rest, found the imperfect melody summoned a much older dissonance, a jarring clash of wills that had once threatened to extinguish the light of philosophy altogether. The flute girl's stumble was innocent, a mere slip of breath, but it reminded him of a far more dangerous lack of harmony. The discordant soul of a tyrant who possessed the power to shatter worlds, but lacked the wisdom to rule himself. The darkness of the Athenian grove seemed to deepen, the shadows lengthening until they resembled the stone walls of a fortress across the sea. In the theatre of his mind, the grey leaves of the olive trees transformed into the deep, brooding blue of the Sicilian coast. He was no longer 80. Heavy with the weight of a life lived in thought, he was 40, his shoulders broad and strong from the wrestling pits, his spirit ignited by a singular, burning hope. He had travelled to Syracuse, the great city of the West, drawn by the allure of a possibility that had haunted him since Socrates drank the hemlock. The dream was simple yet perilous. If a ruler could be turned toward the light, if a king could become a philosopher, then the suffering of the city might finally end. He remembered the heat of Syracuse, a heavy, oppressive warmth that smelled of sulphur from the smoking mountain of Etna and the perfume of decadent courts. Dionysius the Elder sat upon the throne, a man carved from raw appetite and paranoia. The tyrant's promise had been a siren song and invitation to advise, to teach, to mould the laws of the state according to the dictates of virtue. But as Plato walked the marble halls, he found not a student, but a beast pacing in a gilded cage. The memory washed over him with the vividness of a fever. He recalled the texture of the air in the tyrant's court, thick with the unseen currents of fear. Men spoke in whispers, their eyes darting to the shadows, for Dionysius saw treason in every shadow and a dagger in every cloak. Yet the younger Plato, fueled by the memory of Socrates' fearless questioning, had not cowered. He had spoken of geometry, of the perfect forms, of the necessity for a soul to be governed by reason rather than the chaotic storms of desire. He had tried to show the tyrant that true power lay not in the command of armies, but in the mastery of oneself. It was a lesson the tyrant could not endure. The clash was inevitable, a collision between the immovable object of truth and the unstoppable force of ego. He could hear the tyrant's voice now, echoing across the decades, a rough grating sound that lacked all rhythm. Dionysius had asked what the philosopher thought of his vast power, his impregnable walls, his fleets of triremes, and Plato, bound by the sacred duty of the dialectic, had answered that a man who lives in fear of his own subjects is not powerful, but the most wretched of slaves. The rage that followed was swift and terrible. The invitation turned into captivity. The honoured guest became a prisoner of the tyrant's bruised vanity. The promise of a philosopher king dissolved into the crude reality of a despot who would sooner execute the truth than face it. But the true horror, the memory that made the old man's breath hitch even now in the safety of the academy, was not the threat of death, but the degradation that followed. He remembered the ship that was meant to carry him home. The captain, a Spartan named Polis, had been given secret orders, whispered by a tyrant who wished to see the high-minded aristocrat humbled to the dust. The sea had been rough, the waves dark and churning, mirroring the chaos of the political world he was fleeing. They did not sail for Athens. The horizon shifted, the stars wheeled in the wrong direction, and the realization of betrayal set in with the cold clarity of a winter dawn. They landed at Aegina. The island was at war with Athens, a place where an Athenian citizen was not a guest, but a prize of war. The memory slowed here, becoming a sequence of visceral sensations. The rough hands of soldiers seizing him, the broad shoulders that had once thrown opponents in the Isthmian games now twisted back, the coarse rope-binding wrists that had penned tragedies and dialogues. He was Aristocles, son of Ariston, descendant of kings and lawgivers, yet in the marketplace of Aegina he was stripped of name and lineage. He was merely a body, a unit of labour, a beast of burden to be appraised by the highest bidder. The noise of the slave market was a cacophony of misery, the shouting of auctioneers, the weeping of the captive, the clink of coin. He stood upon the stone block, the sun beating down on his brow, exposing him to the gaze of strangers. It was the ultimate test of his philosophy. He had taught that the body is merely a vessel, a tomb for the soul, and that the true self remains untouched by physical chains. But as he stood there, the humiliation was a physical weight, a poison that sought to infect the spirit. He watched the crowd, seeing the tripartite soul of humanity laid bare in its ugliest form. The unchecked appetite of the buyers, the spirited cruelty of the guards, and the utter absence of reason. He remembered looking at his own hands, calloused from the stylus and the gymnasium. Was this the end of the argument? Was force truly the only reality, and justice merely a fable whispered by dreamers? For a moment, the chaos of the world seemed absolute, a swirling void where the good were sold for silver and the wicked feasted in palaces. But the universe, in its mysterious weaving, had not abandoned him. From the throng of faces, a recognition sparked. Aniceres, a man of Cyrene, a chariot racer of some fame and a chaotic spirit in his own right, saw not a slave, but the philosopher. The transaction that followed was swift 20 minni, a sum of silver that seemed absurdly small for a life, yet infinite in its consequence. The ropes were cut. The transaction was annulled. The descent into the abyss was halted by a singular act of friendship, a flicker of light in the crushing dark. The journey back to Athens was silent. The humiliation of the auction block had burned away the last remnants of his youthful political ambition. He realized then as the familiar silhouette of the Acropolis rose against the violet sky, that the salvation of the world would not come from the palaces of tyrants. It could not be imposed from the throne down. It had to be cultivated, seed by seed, in the soil of the mind. As the memory receded, leaving him back in the quiet olive grove at the end of his life, the old man let out a long, slow breath. The flute girl had found her rhythm again, the melody smoothing out into a gentle, flowing cadence. The experience in the slave market had been the crucible. It had stripped him of the illusion that he could engage with the insanity of the political world on its own terms. He had returned to Athens not to rule, but to build a fortress that no tyrant could breach. He looked toward the dark outline of the academy buildings, the structures he had raised on the land purchased with his own ransom money, for his friends had refused to take the silver back, insisting it be used to found a sanctuary. That was the irony the gods had spun. The price of his slavery had become the foundation of the first true university. The academy was his answer to Dionysius. It was a place where the mind was the only sovereign, where young men and women could be trained to see the good, so that if they were ever called to power, they would not be intoxicated by it. He moved away from the doorframe, his legs heavy, but his spirit lightened by the act of remembrance. The fear of that time had long since transmuted into understanding. The chaos of the material world was persistent, yes, like the waves beating against the shore. But the realm of forms, the eternal truths he had spent 40 years teaching in this grove, remained untouched, immutable, and perfect. He walked slowly to his low couch, the straw mattress rustling softly under his weight. The room was simple, devoid of the luxury that had suffocated him in Syracuse. Here, in the quiet dark, he was free. He lay back, closing his eyes, letting the ambient sounds of the night wash over him, the rustle of the wind in the leaves, the distant rhythmic chirping of crickets, and the fading notes of the flute which finally resolved into a peaceful silence. His breathing slowed, matching the cadence of the earth itself. The fatigue was no longer a burden, but a gentle guide leading him toward the final mystery. He had wrestled with the world. He had been a slave and a prince of thought. He had written the laws of the soul. Now, the arguments were finished. The dialogues were concluded. The tripartite soul within him, the hunger, the fire, and the reason began to settle into a profound and unified stillness. As the boundary between waking and sleeping dissolved, a new vision began to take shape behind his closed eyelids. Not of the past, but of a geometry made of light, a perfect circle, closing, returning to its source. The perfect circle of light in his mind began to expand, its edges softening until it was no longer a geometric abstraction, but the blinding, white-hot sun of the Greek summer. The silence of the deathbed dissolved into the roar of a crowd, a sound like the crashing of waves against a rocky shore. He was not old. He was not dying. He was standing on the scorched sand of the wrestling pit, the air thick with the scent of olive oil and dust. Before the world knew him as the father of philosophy, before the dialogues were etched into history, he was simply Aristocles. He looked down at his own hands, not the withered, translucent claws of an 80-year-old man, but broad, formidable hands, capable of crushing an opponent's resolve. He felt the weight of his own shoulders, the expanse of chest that had earned him his nickname, Platon, the Broad One. It was a name given in the sweat and violence of the gymnasium, referring to the breadth of his frame, a physical manifestation of the power he would one day wield over the landscape of thought. In this memory the physical world was paramount. The thrill of the Isthmian games surged through his blood, the spirited part of his soul, the thymos burning bright and untamed. He grappled with other men, learning the geometry of leverage and the physics of balance long before he applied them to the cosmos. But even as he pinned his opponents to the earth, feeling the grit of the palaestra against his skin, there was a hunger in him that victory could not sate. The scene shifted, the roar of the crowd fading into the scratching of a reed pen against papyrus. The wrestler vanished, replaced by the poet. Aristocles sat in the shade of a cypress tree, surrounded by scrolls. He was a descendant of kings and lawgivers, the blood of Son and Codrus flowing in his veins, and he believed his destiny lay in the rhythm of verse. He wrote tragedies, weaving words into tapestries of human suffering and divine will. He dreamed of the Dionysia, of the acclaim of Athens, of his words echoing in the great amphitheatre. He was constructing a world of beautiful lies, believing them to be the highest truth. Then came the fire. It began with a voice, not a thunderous orator's boom, but a coarse questioning tone that cut through the humidity of the Athenian marketplace like a cold wind. He remembered the day he first saw the man Socrates. He was ugly by Athenian standards, with a snub nose and bulging eyes, looking more like a satyr than a sage. But when he spoke, the beautiful lies of the poets crumbled. Socrates did not offer answers. He offered a mirror, reflecting the ignorance that masqueraded as wisdom in every passer-by. Aristocles, the young aristocrat with the broad shoulders and the high ambitions, stood paralyzed. He listened as Socrates dismantled the certainty of a general, then a politician, then a poet, peeling back layers of pretension until only the raw, uncomfortable void of not knowing remained. It was a devastation. It was a liberation. The memory burned with the heat of a literal flame. He saw himself, young and trembling, standing before a brazier. In his hands were his tragedies, the intricate verses he had labored over for years. He looked at the scrolls, then at the fire. The choice was absolute. The poetry was a shadow. The dialectic was the light. With a solemnity that defied his youth, he cast the scrolls into the flames. He watched the parchment curl and blacken, the ink evaporating, the beautiful words turning to ash and smoke that drifted up toward the uncaring gods. Aristocles died in that fire, and Plato was truly born, no longer just broad of shoulder, but broad of mind, sweeping aside the shadows to hunt the real. But the pursuit of the real would lead him into the heart of a nightmare. The sun of his youth was eclipsed by the long shadow of war. The golden age of Athens had shattered under the weight of the Peloponnesian conflict, leaving a fractured city. Plato, destined for politics by his lineage, watched as order collapsed into chaos. He saw his own flesh and blood, his uncles Critias and Charmides, rise to power as leaders of the 30 tyrants. He had hoped for stability. He had longed for a government that would impose reason upon the unruly mob. Instead, he witnessed the horror of unchecked power. The regime was a beast of appetite, consuming the wealth and lives of citizens to feed its own paranoia. The streets of Athens, once the envy of the world, became quiet with the silence of the grave. Plato walked these streets, stepping over the unseen stains of betrayal, realizing that the best men, the aristocrats, were capable of the basest evils. The oligarchy was not the rule of wisdom. It was the tyranny of the spirit and appetite, unyoked from reason. When democracy was restored, he dared to hope again, but the mob proved just as blind as the tyrants. The final, crushing blow came not on a battlefield, but in a courtroom. The memory slowed to a crawl, heavy and viscous. The year was 399 BCE. The air in the prison cell was cool, contrasting with the weeping of friends. Socrates sat in the center, calm, rubbing his leg where the chains had been removed. He spoke of the soul's immortality as if discussing the weather, while Plato, ill and absent in body, but present in every tormented thought, felt the foundations of his world fracture. The city of Athens, the supposed beacon of civilization, was handing a cup of poison to the only man who had ever tried to cure its soul. Plato envisioned the hemlock touching Socrates' lips, the earthy, bitter liquid that would silence the voice of truth. He felt the cold creeping up the limbs of his teacher, the gradual numbness that claimed the feet, then the legs, extinguishing the fire of the finest mind Greece had ever produced. It was the ultimate betrayal. Wisdom had been put on trial and found guilty by ignorance. The trauma of that moment severed Plato's connection to the immediate world. How could one live in a reality where the just man is executed and the wicked thrive? The death of Socrates was the catalyst that shattered his faith in the sensory world. If this world could kill Socrates, then this world was not the true reality. It was a cave. It was a shadow. It was a lie. He withdrew. The broad-shouldered wrestler, the ambitious poet, the disillusioned politician, all of them retreated into the fortress of the mind. He left Athens, becoming a wanderer, carrying the wound of that execution like a physical scar. He travelled to Megara, to Egypt, to Italy, seeking a geometry that could not be corrupted by human folly. In the silence of his exile, the theory began to crystallize. He needed a place where Socrates was safe. He needed a realm where justice was not a variable opinion determined by a jury of 500, but an eternal, unchangeable form. He began to build a new world, not of stone and timber, but of pure thought. He sought the form of the good, a standard absolute and divine, far above the muddy, bloody streets of Athens. The vision of his past began to recede, the noise of the trial fading into the rhythm of the waves carrying him across the Mediterranean. He was moving towards Sicily now, towards Syracuse, driven by a desperate, dangerous hope that perhaps, if a king could not become a philosopher might craft a king. The naivety of youth had been burned away, replaced by a steel-hard conviction that would lead him into the court of Dionysius, into the dragon's den, where the boundaries between teacher and slave would blur in the heat of a new tyranny. The glittering coast of Sicily promised a new horizon, but the court of Dionysius in Syracuse was not the sanctuary of wisdom Plato had hoped for. It was a gilded cage, opulent and terrifying, where the marble floors echoed with the whispers of sycophants and the paranoia of a tyrant. Here the air was thick with perfume and fear. Plato, still carrying the idealism of a man who believed that truth alone could reshape the world, stood before the throne, not as a courtier, but as a mirror. He spoke to Dionysius of virtue, of a king's duty to govern, not by whim, but by the rigid, beautiful geometry of justice. But a tyrant does not wish to see his own reflection. He wishes only to see his power reflected in the submission of others. The relationship fractured. The philosopher's words, intended to heal the state, sounded to the tyrant like the sharpening of a dagger. In a fit of rage that would ripple through history, Dionysius made a decision that sought to strip the philosopher of his dignity. The order was given not to execute him, but to erase his humanity. Plato, the descendant of Solon, the aristocrat of Athens, was seized, bound, and marched onto a Spartan ship. The man of high mind was reduced to a unit of currency. He was sold into slavery. The transition from honoured guest to chattel was a brutal descent into the very mud he sought to transcend. Dragged to the slave market on the island of Aegina, he stood exposed upon the auction block. One can imagine the broad shoulders of the former wrestler, the man once called Aristocles for his physical prowess, now slumped not in defeat, but in a profound, silent observation of human folly. The chains on his wrists were heavy, cold iron, a tactile reminder of the material world's cruelty. This was the earth in its rawest form, unjust, chaotic, governed by appetite and brute force. It was the exact opposite of the star, the unchangeable, luminous reality of the forms he had begun to see in his mind's eye. Fate, however, is as capricious as a tyrant. In the bustle of the market, amidst the shouting of merchants and the weeping of the enslaved, a face appeared in the crowd. Aniceris, a man who knew the worth of the mind standing in chains, recognized him. The ransom was paid, 20 minae, a sum both trivial and infinite, and the chains were struck off. Plato was free, but he was changed. He returned to Athens not with a desire for revenge, but with a confirmed resolution. The world of politics, of flesh and blood kings, was a shadow play on a cave wall. It was time to stop chasing shadows and start building the light. He walked away from the mix, away from the assembly where Socrates had been condemned, and sought the quiet of the outskirts. About a mile outside the city walls lay a grove of olive and plane trees, a green sanctuary sacred to the hero Hecademus. It was a place where the dust of the city did not settle, where the wind rustled through the silver-backed leaves with a sound like whispering voices. Here, in 387 BCE, Plato drove his staff into the earth. He would not build a fortress of stone to keep enemies out. He would build a fortress of logic to keep the chaos of the world at bay. He founded the Academy. It was the first university of the Western world, but it felt more like a monastic brotherhood of the mind. There were no fees, for wisdom could not be sold like a slave in Aegina. Above the entrance the invisible inscription hung in the air, understood by all who approached, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." This was not merely a requirement for mathematics. It was a demand for order. Geometry was the bridge between the messy earth and the perfect star. A triangle drawn in the sand is imperfect, its lines uneven, subject to the wind, but the idea of the triangle, the form of the triangle, is eternal, flawless, and divine. Plato wanted his students to stop looking at the sand and start seeing the form. In the dappled sunlight of the olive grove, he walked. He was no longer the young poet burning his tragedies, nor the wrestler grappling in the dust. He was the conductor of a great silent symphony of thought. He taught them that the soul was not a single simple thing, but a complicated team of rivals. He spoke of the tripartite soul, painting a picture that would dominate psychology for millennia. Inside every human chest, he explained, there is a charioteer reason. This charioteer holds the reins of two horses. One horse is white, noble, and spirited. This is thymus, the spiritedness that drives men to honor and courage, the part of him that had once considered fighting in the cavalry. The other horse is black, wild, and obstinate. This is epithymia, the appetite, the craving for food, for drink, for physical pleasure. The struggle of life, he told his students as they paced the shaded paths, was the charioteer's eternal effort to force these two disparate beasts to run together toward the sky. If the black horse wins, the soul is dragged into the mud of the earth, enslaved by its own desires, just as Plato had been enslaved by the tyrant. If the white horse runs unchecked, the soul becomes arrogant and violent. Only when reason holds the reins with an iron grip can the chariot lift from the earth and ascend toward the truth. He lived this philosophy as strictly as he taught it. He ate simply, slept little, and dedicated his remaining decades to the architecture of the invisible. The chaos of the Peloponnesian War, the screams of the dying, the betrayal of relatives, the judicial murder of Socrates, all of these traumas were compost for his garden. He transmuted the pain of the physical world into the perfection of the intellectual one. He began to write the Republic, a sprawling blueprint, not just for a city, but for the human soul. He constructed a city in words where a philosopher king would rule, not because he craved power, but because he understood the forms. It was a dream born of his failure in Sicily, a correction of reality. The years began to settle upon him like snow. The broad chest of the wrestler thinned, the beard whitened, but the eyes remained fiercely alight. He had created a world within a world. While Athens outside the grove continued its noisy bickering, rising and falling with the tides of history, the Academy remained a fixed point, a star that did not blink. He had managed to stabilize the flux of existence. He had found the good that Socrates had died for, and he had planted it deep in the soil of Western consciousness, where it would grow long after the olive trees had withered. Yet, even as he dwelled in the realm of high forms, the earth remained beneath his feet. He was an old man now, 80 years of life etched into his skin. The grand drama of his existence, the wrestling matches, the wars, the courts of tyrants, the auction blocks, had faded into the quiet rhythm of the grove. The sun was setting on the age of the classical Greeks, and the twilight was coming for him as well. In his final hours, the man who had spent a lifetime seeking the perfect rhythm of the universe found himself listening to the imperfect rhythm of a flute. He lay in repose, his mind still sharp, still analyzing, still seeking the order amidst the chaos. A Thracian girl played for him, the notes floating through the evening air, a simple, earthly melody. Even then, on the threshold of the great unknown, his mind sought precision. He stirred, his voice a rasping echo of the thunder it once was, and gently chided her for missing the beat. The harmony had to be maintained. The star had to guide the earth until the very last breath. The music continued, correcting itself, finding the rhythm he demanded. Plato closed his eyes, the vibrations of the flute merging with the mathematical hum of the cosmos he had spent 80 years trying to hear. The chariot was rising. The horses were finally running in perfect unison, leaving the ground behind. And as the melody drifted into silence, the story of the man ended, and the story of the mind began. But the academy was not empty. The path he cleared was waiting for another traveller, a student from the north, who would walk through those gates and challenge the master himself. The silence that followed the final note of the flute was not an emptiness, but a container, holding within it the resonance of a life that had stretched across the spine of a century. As the old man's chest settled into its final stillness, the room seemed to expand, the boundaries of the stone walls dissolving into the mists of memory. To understand the rhythm he had so desperately sought in those dying moments, the perfect mathematical cadence of the cosmos, one had to travel back through the corridors of time, away from the frail sage and toward the vibrant, muscular youth who once walked the dusty streets of a very different Athens. Long before he was Plato, the broad-browed philosopher of the academy, he was Aristocles, a name given to echo the grandeur of his grandfather, yet a name that would eventually be swallowed by a nickname. He was not born into the quiet contemplation of scrolls, but into the roar of expectation. The blood of kings ran in his veins, tracing back to Codrus, the last legend of the throne, and the blood of lawgivers flowed from Solon on his mother's side. He was a child of the highest aristocracy, born into a city that demanded greatness as a birthright. But the greatness the world expected of young Aristocles was physical and political, not yet of the mind. Imagine the scent of olive oil and crushed sand in the heat of the afternoon. This was the domain of his youth. He was a creature of the gymnasium, a wrestler of immense power and discipline. It was here, grappling in the dust of the wrestling pit, that the name Plato was born. Plates, the broad one. Perhaps it was the width of his forehead, a vast plain behind which a universe was already forming, or perhaps it was the sheer expanse of his shoulders, built to carry the weight of an opponent, and later the weight of Western thought. He competed in the Isthmian Games, second only to the Olympics, his body a testament to the Greek ideal that physical perfection was the mirror of a virtuous soul. He knew the rhythm of the body, the leverage of muscle against bone, long before he sought the leverage of reason against chaos. But there was another rhythm pulsing beneath the wrestler's chest. Before the dialectic took hold of him, Plato was a soul steeped in the rhythms of verse. He was a poet, a dramatist who wove tragedies from the threads of myth. He understood the cadence of the chorus and the meter of the spoken word. He stood once on the precipice of a great competition, a tragedy written and ready to be performed, poised to claim the laurel wreath of the artist. The world was a stage, and he intended to be its playwright. Then came the fire. It was not a fire that fell from the sky, but a flame kindled by a voice. In the bustling, chaotic marketplace of Athens, amidst the hawkers of fish and the arguments of politicians, the broad-shouldered wrestler encountered a man who resembled a satyr more than a sage, Socrates. He was ugly, barefoot, and irritatingly inquisitive, a gadfly stinging the flanks of a lazy horse. Yet when Socrates spoke, the architecture of Plato's world collapsed. The old man did not offer answers. He offered questions that dismantled the very foundations of certainty. In a moment of radical transformation that would define the rest of his existence, Plato turned his back on the theatre. He looked at his tragedies, his meticulously crafted verses, and saw only shadows on a wall. Legend tells us he took those scrolls, the labour of his artistic youth, and fed them to the flames. He watched the paper curl and blacken, the poetry turning to ash, vowing to pursue a harder, steeper path. He traded the rhythm of the iambic foot for the rigorous, unforgiving rhythm of the dialectic. Yet the search for order was driven by a profound and violent trauma. The Athens of his prime was not a city of marble serenity, but a nightmare of blood and betrayal. He watched as his own relatives, his uncles Critias and Charmides, rose to power as leaders of the 30 tyrants, a brutal oligarchy that bathed the city in terror. He saw the men of his own blood, men of high birth and breeding, succumb to the darkest appetites of the soul. He realized then that noble lineage was no shield against corruption. The final fracture came in 399 BCE. The restored democracy, in a fit of paranoia and vengeance, condemned Socrates to death. Plato, then a man of roughly 28 years, watched the only truly just man he had ever known drink the hemlock. The state had killed its conscience. The trauma shattered Plato's faith in political life. He saw that no existing state was well governed, that the world was a ship steered by drunken sailors who had no knowledge of the stars. He retreated, the noise of the assembly becoming unbearable to ears that now strained for a higher harmony. He fled into the wider world, seeking a cure for the madness of men. He travelled to the geometric sands of Egypt and the coastlines of Italy, absorbing the mysticism of Pythagoras, learning that the universe was written in numbers, but the world was cruel, and the philosopher was not immune to its ironies. In Sicily he sought to mould a tyrant, Dionysius athirst, into a philosopher king, believing that power and wisdom could be fused. It was a disastrous ambition. The tyrant, enraged by Plato's frankness, had the philosopher seized. There, in the humid, chaotic marketplace of Aegina, the broad-shouldered aristocrat, the descendant of kings, stood in chains. He was sold as a slave, a piece of merchandise to be bartered for 20 minae. It was the ultimate inversion of his reality. The man who argued that the soul was the only true sovereign was now owned by another. Yet, even in chains, his mind remained the master. Ransomed by a friend who recognized the absurdity of the situation, he returned to Athens not broken but refined by the fire of experience. He returned to a grove of olive trees just outside the city walls, a sanctuary dedicated to the hero Hecademus. Here, he planted the seeds of a new kind of empire, not one of land and armies, but of thought. He founded the Academy, the first university of the Western world. Above its entrance he placed no guards but a warning: let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. It was a fortress of the mind, a place where the chaos of the political world could be kept at bay by the rigorous application of reason. For 40 years he walked beneath those trees, teaching that the world we see is but a shadow of a higher, perfect reality, the forms. He taught that the soul was a chariot pulled by 2 horses, spirit and appetite, which must be reined in by the charioteer of reason. He lived as he taught, a man in constant tension, wrestling his own spirit, subduing his own appetites, seeking that perfect, unchanging note he had demanded from the flute girl in his final moments. The music had stopped, and the old wrestler lay dead. The scroll of his life had been written, from the wrestling pits to the slave markets, from the fires of poetry to the cool shade of the academy. But the grove was not silent. The path he had cleared through the thicket of ignorance remained open. The wind rustled the olive leaves, whispering of a legacy that would outlast the stone of Athens itself. And as the sun began to rise over the city that had killed his teacher, the gates of the academy stood ready. Steps were approaching from the north, sharp, purposeful steps of a new mind, a student who would walk into the garden, look at the master's world of forms, and prepare to bring philosophy back down to the earth. The footsteps that approached were not heavy like a wrestler's, nor tentative like a novice's, but sharp, rhythmic, and driven by a restless energy that seemed to measure the very earth it tread upon. The young man from Stagira, Aristotle, walked into the grove not merely as a mourner, but as the next great tide in the ocean of thought. He had come from the north, wearing rings on his fingers and carrying a mind that was less like a flame seeking the heavens and more like a lantern examining the ground. Where Plato had looked upward to the perfect, invisible forms of the stars, this new student looked downward, entranced by the intricate biology of a seashell, the veins of a leaf, and the mechanics of the physical world. The broad-shouldered master was gone, but the conversation he had started, the dialectic that had begun in the bustling marketplace with Socrates, did not end with his last breath. It merely changed its tone, shifting from the poetic aspirations of a soul yearning for flight to the rigorous categorization of a world teeming with life. The academy, that quiet sanctuary nestled among the olive trees and plane trees just outside the city walls, fell into a hushed reverence, but it did not fall into silence. The death of the body was, after all, something Plato had spent decades preparing for, describing it not as a tragedy, but as a liberation, a final unchaining of the prisoner from the shadowy cave. His students, walking the gravel paths where the master had once paced, felt the weight of his absence, yet the air was thick with his presence. The stone benches where he had sat still seemed to hold the warmth of his arguments. The gymnasium, where he had insisted that the body must be honed to support the mind, still echoed with the sounds of wrestling and the rhythmic breathing of young men training for the rigor of philosophy. In the days and years that followed, the academy became more than a school. It transformed into a fortress of the mind. It was a garden where the seeds of Western thought were not just planted, but cultivated with obsessive care. Plato had left behind no rigid set of commandments, no stone tablets of unchangeable law. Instead, he had left dialogues, conversations frozen in ink, plays without a stage, where ideas were the protagonists and ignorance the antagonist. These scrolls were gathered and preserved, copied by hand in the quiet corners of the library, the ink drying like the blood of a new lineage. In these texts, Socrates was alive again, forever questioning, forever stinging the sluggish horse of Athens like a gadfly, forever dying his noble death. Plato had achieved the immortality he sought, not by clinging to his physical form, but by transmuting his soul into words that would outlast the marble temples of the Acropolis. As the seasons turned, painting the grove in the gold of autumn and the lush green of spring, the leadership passed to others, to his nephew Speusippus, then to Xenocrates, but the spirit remained undeniable. The unending conversation continued. Aristotle would eventually leave to found his own school, the Lyceum, walking a different path, yet he would remain forever bound to his teacher. The history of philosophy became a duet between these two giants, the man who pointed to the heavens and the man who pointed to the earth. Every question asked about the nature of reality, about how we should live, about what is just and what is true, was a footnote to the pages written in this olive grove. Centuries rolled over Athens like waves over a shoreline. The Macedonian phalanxes marched through, followed by the iron legions of Rome. Emperors and generals came to the academy not to conquer, but to listen. They walked the sacred grounds, humbled by the invisible architecture of logic that stood taller than their triumphal arches. The physical world, the world of becoming that Plato had viewed with such suspicion, continued its chaotic churn. Cities burned, empires crumbled, and statues lost their heads to the violence of time. But the world of being, the realm of forms, of perfect triangles and absolute justice, remained untouched, safe within the fortress of the dialogues. There is a profound resilience in the fragility of papyrus and parchment. When the Dark Ages descended and the lights of learning flickered out across Europe, the voice of Plato did not vanish, it trefoiled. It was carried in the saddlebags of merchants and the chests of scholars to the desert libraries of the East. In Baghdad and Damascus, wise men translated the Greek into Arabic, marveling at the mind of the man they called Aflatun. They kept the conversation alive while the West slept, and when the wheel of history turned again, bringing the Renaissance to Florence and Rome, Plato returned like a long-lost king. His works were rediscovered with the force of revelation, igniting fires of art and science that would shape the modern world. The painter Raphael would depict him in the center of the school of Athens, an old man with a grey beard, walking through a vaulted hall, stepping out of history and into the eternal present. We are still walking in that grove. Every time a person questions the reality presented to them, every time a scientist seeks the laws behind the chaos of nature, Every time a leader asks what makes a society just, they are participating in the conversation Plato began. The cave he described, where prisoners watch shadows dancing on the wall and mistake them for reality, remains the most haunting metaphor of the human condition. We are still sitting in that cave, mesmerized by the flickering screens and shifting illusions of our own time, and the voice of the old wrestler still whispers to us from the dark, urging us to turn our heads, to stand up, to brave the blinding pain of the light, and see the world as it truly is. The sun that had risen over the academy on that first morning without him eventually set, as it does every day. The cycle of day and night, of waking and sleeping, continued its rhythmic march, but in the quiet of the mind, the sun of his intellect never truly went down. The wrestler had won his final match. He had penned the chaos of existence to the mat and forced it to reveal its order. He had taken the tragic, messy, beautiful clay of human life and sculpted it into something that could touch the divine. Now, the grove is silent again. The ancient olive trees have long since returned to the earth, replaced by new growth, fed by the same soil. The physical academy is a ruin of scattered stones, visited by tourists who step lightly over the dust. But if you close your eyes, the stones disappear. The noise of the modern city fades into a hum, like the sound of bees in the thyme. The air cools. The light softens into the indigo of twilight. You can feel the presence of the vast, open sky above. The same sky that Aristocles, the boy with the broad shoulders, once studied with wonder. The heavy curtains of history are drawn back, revealing a stage that is empty and peaceful. The arguments are over for now. The dialectic has come to a rest. The spirited horses of the soul have been calmed by the gentle hand of reason, and the chariot glides smoothly into the night. The struggle to harmonize the parts of the soul, the appetite, the spirit, and the mind resolves into a single sustained chord of silence. It is time to leave the marketplace of Athens. It is time to leave the wrestling pit and the lecture hall. The questions that plague the waking mind are allowed to dissolve, losing their hard edges in the soft waters of sleep. There is no need to strive for the forms tonight. There is no need to search for the perfect definition of courage or piety. Those things exist, shining and immutable, high above the clouds, watching over you like the constellations. You are safe in the knowledge that the universe is not a chaotic accident, but a place of order, governed by a wisdom that runs deeper than the deepest ocean. The philosopher lays down his scroll. The flute girl lowers her instrument. The lamp flickers and dies, leaving only the comforting scent of olive oil and the cool touch of the night air. The conversation pauses, waiting for another dawn, another thinker, another mind to pick up the thread. But for you, the thread leads only to rest. Drift away from the ancient city. Float upwards, past the Acropolis, past the white columns glowing in the moonlight, past the shadows of the cave. You are rising into the realm of the stars, the realm of quiet perfection, where nothing changes, nothing fades, and nothing hurts. The great, broad silence of the cosmos wraps around you, a blanket woven from the fabric of eternity. The dialogue is finished. The story is told. The wrestler sleeps. Good night.